Ready.
Hello, I'm John Lee Anderson. I'm a writer with the New Yorker magazine. I'm an American. I live in England. I've been a reporter for many years, and when Marcella has asked me to talk about what my big year was or has been, I immediately thought of 1 year. It's difficult in a long life. I'm 56, so I could choose a number of years in which I had various successes or this or that. But I think my year, the year 1970, 1971, that is, it's 1 year, it's a school year from September to June, approximately. That period, when I was 13 and I turned 14 and I lived in Liberia, was a very big year for me. And I'll explain why. I was the son of a Foreign Service officer and a children's book author. I was one of 5 children. And I was raised in many different countries around the world. Although I was born in California, we had lived in Korea, Colombia, Taiwan, Indonesia, and after an unfortunate move to Indonesia in which we were evacuated medically, I nearly died of an illness, so did one of my younger sisters, and we had to return to the United States. I was very upset. I didn't want to come back to the United States. I was only 12, and a previous 10-month experiment, a previous 10-month experience there had been pretty traumatic. I hadn't adjusted well. The children in the school in Washington, D.C., in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., had called me a white chink because I had Chinese behavior, they thought. And so when we moved to Indonesia, I was very pleased to be leaving again, and to have it cut short after such a short period of time was a real blow to me. And so when we returned to the States, I was very upset. I ran away a few times. And my parents, in despair over what to do with me, asked me if I wanted to go and live for a year with my Uncle Warren, who was a geologist, my mother's brother, in Liberia, where he was living with his family as a geologist. And I leapt at the chance. And I immediately said yes, and I was thrilled to go to live in Africa. As I said, we'd lived in Asia and Latin America, but I'd always dreamed of going to Africa, and I had reared myself on books about African animals and explorers and naturalists, and I wanted nothing more than to go to Africa. And so it was that at 13, I went to live with my Uncle Warren and my Aunt Doris in Liberia. This was Liberia at a very particular time. If Africa was in some ways engulfed with post-colonial violence, I wasn't so aware of it at the time. And Liberia was a kind of anomaly because it was a state founded by freed slaves and somehow left outside of the whole colonial experience. It was affecting other countries. My uncle and aunt lived just outside the capital of Monrovia. Power was held by a dictator. In those days, he was called a benevolent dictator who had ruled since the 1930s. His name was William Buchanan Shadrach Tubman Jr. And he was a very old-fashioned man. He wore a Homburg, he wore 3-piece suits, and he smoked cigars, and was a real character. I would have to say that, what I'm getting at is that Liberia was somehow my coming of age. Although, in an extent, I'd merely traded my parents for my aunt and uncle, I was now doing so, under their authority in a new country. I went to an international school. My schoolmates were the elite of that country, Libero-Americans, who were the former slave caste who held power in the country. The children of Lebanese merchants, and a few Americans and other nationalities. But I was entirely focused focused on the possibilities that Africa gave me for, exploration and adventure. And to an extent, my uncle and aunt facilitated this. I was lucky because my uncle was a kind of an adventurer at heart himself. He'd grown up in an early 20th century America in the California mountains. He was a kind of mountain man, an outdoorsman, and they approved of that kind of hardy experience, which is exactly what I wanted. I made friends with the cook of my uncle and aunt, and they let me go with him to his home village on several occasions, which was 8 hours by car or bus until the paved roads ran out in the middle of the country, and then 8 hours by foot on a jungle path to a village called Balama, which is where he came from. And in Balama, I experienced Africa as unchanged Africa, an Africa that really the 20th century had not touched. As I said, it was an 8-hour walk. Our arrival was heralded to the village by drums. I could hear the drums. There was no electricity. The huts were made out of mud and straw. Children under the age of 12 burst into tears when they saw me because they had never, ever seen a white person before. I remember small clearings where there would just be single-family farmers. These were people of the Pele tribe, where for the entire time that I was there, I remember stopping to eat an iguana, a kind of lizard, with a woman and a child. And the entire time I was there, the child never stopped screaming in horror at me. It was really, really something. In Balama, I was invited to dance, and for the first time in my life, because I was shy about music, I danced for the first time in Balama, and I danced with a group of children who were chanting and dancing to the sounds of one child made on a cracker tin lid. And I did somersaults in that dance. I'd never danced in my life, and I'd never danced like that since. And I always felt that somehow, African rhythm entered my blood on that night, and I've always loved that music ever since. It was a wonderful experience. I was also given a name by the Pele people, because I didn't just go once. I went several times. I was given a name. They called me Saki, which I understood them to mean, them to say that it meant tall man, because I was a very tall boy, and they were rather short people. I should just say, parentheses, that many years later, I returned to Liberia, and I have several times, and I returned to that village. And after 27 years, the chief's wife remembered me, or claimed to. And when I asked about the meaning of my name, there was a big palaver, as they call a kind of, a discussion afterwards. And at length, I was informed that it didn't mean tall man, it meant the boy who arrived by surprise. My name meant the boy who arrived by surprise. And they remembered me as that. I became known to the people of Balama because I lived through several dramatic experiences there, which were also very formative to me. Not just my naming and my dancing for the first time, but I was there at the end of the year when the traditional bush devil comes through and, as they say, steals children to take away with him. Now, the bush devil he's a character in Liberia and in West Africa, that the number of bush devils, each tribe has these I call them creatures. They're actually men. They live in the forest in their own sort of lair that you can't come into. And in the case of the Pele people near Balama, they were, the bush devil came to the villages where the people lived, and when the boys were of adolescent age, entering puberty, he would literally abduct them and take them to the bush school, which is where he lived. They called it the bush school. And they might be there for 3 or 4 years or even longer. And this is by tribal tradition. It was in the bush schools that all the men come of age. They learn the history of the tribe, the oral history. They learn how to hunt, how to be men. They're scarified, they're circumcised, and they're eventually returned to their families. In the case of those who show special aptitudes, sometimes they're kept and they become the assistants of the bush devil. Some who show an ability with natural medicine are made into healers. The point is that nobody can see the bush devil. And when the bush devil comes, and in a sense the tribe was ruled through fear, because, as I said, they described their children as being stolen. And this had all happened to them as well, but it was a kind of self-perpetuating system that they didn't know how to break. I was there when the bush devil came. I was attending a dance at the chief's hut with all the other people of the village, and word began to spread that the bush devil was coming. Now the bush devil, I couldn't hear it at the time because all I heard was screaming, and my host, Moses, the cook of my uncle, made me run with him to his hut, which was a dirt-floored hut, and where he made me lie down like he did, face down in the dirt, and he said that we couldn't look up or move until the bush devil had passed through the village. And you could hear the bush devil coming because he played music. And later I learned that the bush devil wears costumes that you can't see. You can see these in museums, rare costumes that have been found by collectors and are in museums. And he played something like a long wooden horn and an assistant who played a kind of primitive guitar. And with this way, they heralded their arrival and their passing through. And I was told by Moses that no one in the village could move while the bush devil came through on pain of a juju. Now, juju means a curse. And in the case of that village, as he explained to me, it could mean death. I know from anthropologists later that the juju in that area could have meant, for instance, chopped leopard whiskers in your rice, which give you peritonitis and make you die in 3 days. Now, essentially, they kind of poison. But they didn't know that. The people of Balama would have only understood that the bush devil had, if they had dared to look at him, that he would have sentenced them to death. And if it was a lesser offense against the bush devil, he might sentence them to taxation of their crop that year, or something like that. At any rate, I listened to the bush devil pass by the hut. He went away, and we didn't know what happened until the next day, when the word came that he had not taken any children from Balama, but he had from the next village 3 children. And in each case, he left broken glass on the doorstep of their parents' homes. That was how the parents knew that their children had been taken. When he came back the next day, through the village, he came back right by the hut again, and we had to lie down again, face down. Well, I had many experiences in Balama and in the jungle around there on my many trips up country, as they called it, in Liberia, as I was ending my 13th year and beginning my 14th year. And I learned some of their language as well, the Pele language. And so for me, this was an experience in a world that seemed timeless and extremely rare. And this was the Africa of my imaginings. Africa, unadulterated Africa, with its own spirit world, its own creation myths, its own realities. And so for me, it was a glimpse of something that was extraordinary, and I've never forgotten it. And I felt no fear in Africa or amongst the Africans. And that same year, I always felt, I should just say, very embraced and made a member and a close member of whichever community I was visiting, whether Balama or, in other cases, other deep, villages lost deep in the jungle of Liberia. And of course, I got into a bit of trouble with both my aunt and uncle and my parents later, Although in those days, there was no internet, there was not even cell phones, and nobody thought to make long-distance calls. So I could be gone for a few days before people really realized. But I was always pushing the boundaries of the permission I had gained to go off exploring. And sometimes I got in trouble. One time I crossed into neighboring Guinea, which at the time was a Marxist dictatorship that was closed off to the outside world. And I was arrested. I was captured and arrested only for half of a day. But initially as a spy. I found that Africans couldn't really gauge my age, even though I was just a boy of 13. And they held me as a spy. And this was because I crossed into their country by canoe, and they didn't know who I was. Eventually I was returned and I was safe, but when my uncle and aunt found out about it, of course they were appalled and tried to keep me closer. But I just, every experience I had whetted my appetite for more, and as I was saying earlier, I felt no fear at this age, and I wanted more and more and more. And in the course of the school year, I had arranged to take off 2 months and go to East Africa, where my parents and my uncle and aunt knew at least one family in each major capital. And I was supposed to, be under their care and be a good boy and stay, and be under their supervision. But instead, I arrived in East Africa and I took off on my own. And I walked off into the bush, and I had a lot of adventures. And I never had any fear, but as I say, I got into quite a bit of trouble with the adults because they didn't know how to control me. And when I eventually returned, I actually was supposed to only go for a month. 2 months, after 2 months, a month late, and with a foot that almost had to be amputated because of a tropical infection, I was told off. But in the long and the short of it, this year was deeply formative. At the end of the year, I wanted to stay on in Africa. In fact, I remember a Swiss adventurer came through and invited me to go with him on a camel across the Sahara, and I begged my aunt and my uncle, and through her, my parents, to let me go with him. And of course, they didn't let me. I eventually had to leave in, I think, June or so, and at the end of 9 months, and returned to